Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski.
Talking about running in the 70s. Today on the podcast, we're with somebody who gets a tagline, I'm high on life. If you've ever met him, you know that, you know his smile. Today on the podcast, a Western Pennsylvania runner who has been doing it starting in the 70s and pretty much ever since. Welcome today on the podcast, Kerry Green.
Thank you, Matt. Really a pleasure to be here, buddy. Going back to our Johnstown days, buddy. Good to talk to you.
I've known you since the 70s. I know that you were a school athlete from early age up through high school, but let's concentrate on your entry into running. When was the first time you ran a running workout as a cross-country or track athlete?
Yeah, I got to tell you, growing up, I did all the team sports and I was just into physical activity. So it didn't matter if it was biking, swimming, tennis. Our side yard in our home for years was the place to go to play wiffle ball. And then wiffle ball would transfer into football games. And then we'd go to the driveway when basketball season kicked in. We were just always active all the time. Back in those days, it was always the team sports. My senior year at Westmont High School outside of Johnstown there, I finally was smart enough not to do football any longer, put that aside. And I thought, well, to get in shape for basketball, I'll do cross country, running in basketball shoes. The coach there, nice guy, he was a wrestling coach and just picked up cross country. If I recall, all we ever did was run the course for time every day. That was it. That's how bizarre. But the nice thing was the guys who were 1 and 2 were twins, John and Jim Herdman.
Yeah.
They literally won every race until we got to states. So even though we weren't all that good, with John and Jim going 1 and 2, you're like, hey, we just kept moving along. But I never considered myself a runner. Like I said, I just ran in basketball shoes. And then the greatest thing in my life that turned my life was I go to IUP and not considering myself a runner in any way, shape, or form. At that point now, you're getting into real life, you're taking classes. And the guy I was going to room with IUP happened to get an internship in Johnstown. So I wasn't going to have a roommate, basically. So he was packing up to go back to Johnstown to start the semester in his internship. And the guy by the name of Kevin Lease, who you probably remember from IUP,
yeah,
was just a great guy. Kevin was those guys, you just, as soon as you hear his name, you kind of light up because he was just a fun dude to be around. He always had that chaw of tobacco between the lip and gum there.
Yeah.
And I think he just drove Sutton crazy because whenever we'd go to an away meet, he'd show up like a pajama top in some ripped jeans before ripped jeans were in style. He was just a character. But anyway, he walks into the room to say goodbye to the guy that I was going to room with. And I'm putting on gray sweats to go out and jog on a January day. He looks at me, he goes, you a runner? And I go, yes, I am. And he goes, I'm on a track team. I'm going to track practice. You want to come with me? I go, sure. Yeah. I go over there. I know not what I'm doing. So we take off a bunch of, let's say there's a dozen of us at least. And we're just heading out the road past the Rustic Lodge. And I have no idea where we're going. And I keep thinking we're going to get back on campus. And suddenly we get to the 4-mile mark and we turn around. It dawns on me, hey, we've got to go back to just exactly where we came out. And then within about a mile, everyone's gone, right? And I'm in my basketball shoes and gray sweats. And Kevin, just because he felt guilty because he asked me to go along, he stays with me. By the time we get to the Rustic Lodge now, I said, hey, I need to walk a little bit. So now we're walking and jogging. And then we get back to the field house and we're in the parking lot. He goes, hey, listen, we get together every day here at 3:30. He goes, you're welcome to keep coming back. And I'm thinking to myself, are you nuts? But I'm saying, oh, great, that'd be fine. And then I just kept showing up and no one said anything. And I mixed right in with the guys. And about 2 weeks later, now we're into like late January. And one of the guys goes, hey, we're going to the track today to do intervals. I go, what are intervals? And they go, oh, you'll see. And so we go down the track. If I recall the way Ed always set up, we did repeat miles on Mondays. And then Wednesdays, we would do repeat either quarters or halves. Mm-hmm. And so you know how intervals go. You got the gunners that are out from the gallon right when he says go. Then you got the pack of guys. Then you got a couple of stragglers. And then we happen to have a guy named Tiltman, if you recall.
Mike Robbins.
Yeah. And he had that biomechanical oddity of always leaning to his left. So he'd be last. I'd be 5 yards behind Tiltman. And then my whole goal in intervals was to catch up with everyone before we start the next repetition, right? Wow. But no one ever said, hey, you suck, or hey, you're really slow. And I just kept coming back. And then finally, about 2 months into it, Fry goes, "Hey, Kerry," he goes, "you want a locker and some sweats? Oh, that'd be great." There was a guy named Al Murphy. This is about a month later now. It was, or 3 months into it. He goes, "Hey, Kerry, I'm going to get some new running shoes. What size shoe do you take?" I go, "About 9.5." He goes, "I'll give you my old ones." So now I had sweats, a locker, and a pair of running shoes. I'm a runner, man.
Yeah, you bandited your way onto the track team.
Yeah, really. And like I said, but the sweetest thing was, people could have been nicer. I always wondered in the back of my mind, when Fry and Raymore and Sutton get together, does anyone ever say, "Hey, who's the dude in the gray sweats and the basketball shoes? And what's he doing here?" And that conversation had to fall someplace, but no one ever said anything to me. And like I said, now I got sweats and I keep coming back. And then going back to your question, what was the first real race? I think I jumped in a couple, either 2 miles or 3 miles when we had home track meets. Then right around end of August, early September was the very early on that thing called the Charleston distance run. It was a 15 miler. So some of the guys back in Johnstown who I knew then, like John Hess and people, were going to go down. So I went down. That was my first real road race, the 15 miler down in Charleston. Went down with Hess and a guy named Tom Freebus and some buddies. And Fry ended up doing, I think it was like top 10. And that was a world-class run. As a matter of fact, one of the cool things about that race was that would have been 74. Yeah. And the guy that placed third was a guy named William Rogers, who nobody really knew who he was. The following April, which would have been 1975, the whole running world knew who he was because he won the Boston, an American record 209. But at Charleston, we still didn't know who the guy was. Who's William Rogers?
How much training distance were you doing, and how'd you do in this 15-mile run?
I want to say I ran about an hour 32. And then the other cool thing was I would go to all the cross-country practices, but I got to tell you, Ed and the whole crew, no one was counting on me for points or making the team, right? So I would just show up and practice every day, do my thing. And by the way, in 74, that fall was when we had the first CC house.
Right.
And I always give thanks to Jim Lear, who we call Jet, Stan Rosenthal, Tom McDowell, were the guys that originally thought that concept. We couldn't get enough for 10 guys in the house who were all runners. So we had 10 guys, but I think maybe 6 of them were runners. I roomed with, I believe, Todd Eschman that first year.
Wow.
Then Hess starts talking about, "Hey, I want to do a marathon now." And he goes, "There's one in Buffalo, New York." And I thought, and it's going to end at Niagara Falls. And I thought, great, I'd love to see Niagara Falls. I didn't care about the run so much, but I'd love to see Niagara Falls. Late October of 74, John and Donna Hess and I go up and we run the Buffalo Marathon. I didn't know a whole lot about it. I ran, I think 19 miles was my longest run. But back then, the Olympic trials qualifying time, the trials before was 2:32, and I ran at 2:42. So back in the day, that was a decent time. And then that kind of became our bread and butter because since we were in the IA, the NAI actually had a national marathon with its track meet. So that became my bread and butter.
How did you connect with these runners outside? Hess, Molnar, what was the running scene like in Johnstown for people who weren't in university?
John was about 10 years older than all of us. He was, again, Mr. Sports. He won the Senior Athletic Award at Westmont High because, again, Mr. Basketball, Baseball, Football. As you move on in the years, you can't just go play football somewhere. So John took up jogging and running, so to speak. And we got to know each other through that. And then Molnar, same thing. As we started to do races, we started to learn about him. Ken Horho was the local sports reporter for the Tribune Democrat. So the main deal was baseball, basketball, football. He always found a way to cover a little bit of running. One of my early memories, even though I wasn't a runner at the time, was I'd get the sports page every morning. And it always was key in my mind because I was impressed with endurance athletes was that I knew sometime in the springtime there was an event called the Boston Marathon. And he would not only show the picture of the winner with a photo and an article, but he also lists, like, there was a guy named Donnie Slusser from IUP that finished well, and Steve Molnar from Johnstown did this. And then eventually we got together with Steve and we would start doing our weekend runs together. It just progressed from there. One of the funnier things out of all of it was Steve and John got the idea, hey, in 1976, let's go to New York and run the 50-mile national championship. And so here's this guy I'm walking, jogging, right, 2 years before that, and couldn't even get back to the field house with the guys, probably running 7 miles, whatever we were doing. And we go to New York City and run 10 laps around a 5-mile loop in Central Park, and we win the national championship as a team.
How many people were there? Ultra running. What was the community like? And what were the aid stations like in the 70s?
The only time you passed an aid station was at the start and the finish was at the same place. So you kept doing the loop around there. Basically, a guy named Tom Lochran, who owned the local Baskins Three Robins, Westmont and Johnstown there, he came up with us, and a guy named Tom Freebus, he went to Lehigh. So we drove to Lehigh, stayed overnight, then drove into New York City. And those guys gave us Coca-Cola basically. And because it was fall, so it was around Halloween, we always had the Three Musketeer bars. So back then you didn't have energy bars and all that stuff. So we fueled on Coca-Cola every lap and some Musketeer bars. The winner was a guy named Frank Basanich, who I still now follow on Facebook. He was the ultra guy back in the 70s and 80s. Frank was setting American records and winning everything. And Molnar probably ended up fourth that day. And Steve-O was about, I want to say, maybe 5 hours and 40 minutes or 45. John was about 10 minutes behind Steve. And I ran 5:55. I remember that. Wow. And then when you totaled our place and time, we were the winners, which it's mind-boggling. Just fun times, because like you said, it was the early days. And the funny thing is, back then, there weren't that many ultras around. And now you've got literally every state, I think, has a 50 mile or 100 mile or all those things have taken off.
When did you get your first pair of real running shoes that wasn't a hand-me-down?
Probably that summer. I think it was the Brooks Country, it was called. It was white and had three green stripes on it. And that's what I ran in that Charleston distance run.
What do you remember about running around Johnstown in the summers as a runner? How'd the cars treat you, people in the neighborhood?
It wasn't that bad. Every now and again, you'd get someone that yell or throw something. But for the most part, we were just doing our own thing. And what's funny is when you go back there now, and if I go over the last 20 years, I go back for just to see friends and catch up with DC Noakes and Steve and John and whoever's around. I try to run some of those same loops. And I think, my God, no wonder we were so good, because we're running up and down mountains.
Giant hills, yeah. First time I ran a long run with you is something that I'd like to get the history of, if you remember. And it was a traffic light in Westmont that led to an 18-mile road to Ligonier.
Yeah, it was just straight over the Ligonier summit, right down to Ligonier. Exactly. For some reason, we called it the first Sunday in August run to Ligonier. And so we started at Stutzman Elementary School, which is now a CVS pharmacy. And just like you said, ran over the mountain road there into Ligonier. And what was crazy was just hearing how intense John and Steve were. Probably about, 8 years after we started that, they started running back. So they'd run over 17 and then run back 17. You're like, hats off to you guys, man.
How did the word get around? I found it right after I graduated high school, and a high school buddy of mine joined, but there must have been 25 or 30 people.
Yeah, I think again, it was at Ken Horoho. We put a sign that said something, it was the intersection there of Monaco and Goucher Street. And then because you and I were in contact through IUP at that point, so some of the IUP guys would come in, Abbott or Tiltman, or I remember Paul Yerke and
Dave Thompson.
Dave. Yeah, sure. Dave. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So the numbers were just built. We put a sign there, and then Ken Horoho would write up a little spiel about it just to get us off. And it wasn't a race. We would just jog over all together. Like I said, you were literally run over a mountain pass there, right?
Yeah. 5 miles to the chicken place, and then still another 12 more miles to go on the road. But there wasn't a problem. It was a big road, a 2-lane road, giant hills. Traffic was never a problem.
Exactly. Yeah, the traffic was minimal out there. I'll tell you, when I go back anymore, though, as the suburbs have built up, the traffic coming in on that road now is when you run it in the mornings is, wow, where are all these cars coming from?
Okay, you went from team sports, but competition sports where the results mattered, and a football game, basketball game, everything goes down to the end. Now you're in the college teams where you're not competing till you find the marathon. What was your attitude about competition, and what were you doing with those other sports now that you put so much time into running?
I stayed active, like some intramural stuff, but running was the main focus. As the endurance stuff picked up, we did that national championship 50. And next year, John wanted to do that JFK 50. And that's still the longest going ultra marathon in America. Kennedy started it. That's why it's called the JFK back in 1963. So in 77, we go down there, and I told John, we had just run the New York City Marathon together with Molnar, and I'd run like 2:27. And that was an epiphany race, because I always thought the guys running under 2:30 were like genetic freaks. I thought, I'll never run that. And it was the second time they brought New York to all 5 boroughs. The early years, it would run just loops around Central Park, like our 50 miler.
Huh.
So 1977 was the first time we went to the streets. And so I get in there, the gun goes off, and you go over the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. I'm running nicely. And then you're on a flat in Brooklyn. And I can see the lead pack up ahead. And then suddenly people start to fall off the lead pack. And I recognize immediately the stride of Frank Shorter.
Really?
Yeah. So we're going through Brooklyn, and it's just a straight shot from when you get off the Verrazano Bridge, you're at about a little over 2 miles. And then till you get up to about 8, it's just a straight shot. I think it's 4th Avenue in Brooklyn. And I could see myself gaining, and suddenly I'm right behind Frank Shorter. And he's just, and by the time, when you're in the top 50, you're by yourself, right? It's not like there's a pack of people. So I go, I can't pass Frank Shorter. So I'm running there for a little while. And finally I pull beside him and I go, hey, Frank, thanks for coming out and running today. Because I figured if I'm going by him, he's not having a great day for whatever reason. And he goes, no, thanks, same to you, man. You run, keep it rolling. And then I went on. The other thing that remember, just a key thing, there's funny things you remember in time, but I remember going through the 5 mile mark and the time was like 27:20. And just like the week before, we had a 5 mile cross country run at Mack Park. I think I ran like 26:50. So you're only 30 seconds different. So I'm thinking to myself, Kerry, this is going to be really good or really bad. I guess the catch with me was I couldn't run all that fast, but the pace I could run, like for a cross country, I didn't have to shift that much to just keep going for miles and miles. So then I end up, let's say at the 22 mile mark, I remember seeing a clock and it said 2 hours and 2 minutes. And I thought to myself, God, you're going to be easily under 2:30. And you got to do is keep up the pace you're doing, which is that point I was slowing a little bit, but not dramatically. And sure enough, cross finish line 2:27. And like I said, at that point, it was like, damn. And then John was heavy duty on doing the JFK 3 weeks later. And I was like, okay, but I said, I tell you what, we're running together. I said, I'm not taking off. I said, we're just staying together. And so the thing that got us through JFK, you mentioned the aid stations. Here's a 50-mile race with no aid stations at that point, right?
Wow.
My brother Sean, who was a national park ranger at Shenandoah, he got some topo maps and figure out where he could meet us, because you run over the Appalachian Trail, and then at about, I want to say 18 miles, you come off the Appalachian Trail onto the C&O Canal. So right there at 18, you start to get a nice flat stretch where you just cruise on the C&O Canal. So he found out where he could meet us about every 6 miles on the C&O Canal with 2 jugs of Coke and 3 Musketeer bars. And then John and I would just woof down that, and the 3 of us would put our fists together and go, 1 for all and all for one. And boom, and then we'd take off again. And then 5 or 6 miles later, Sean would find us. Hey, we all woof it down, fists together. And then as we'd run by, there were people that would be tracking. Hey, you guys are in, let's say, 20th and 21st place. And we'd both look at them and go, we're in 20th place because we're running together. Then they go, you're in 11th and 12th. We're in 11th. And suddenly we got up to 3rd.
Wow.
And then at that point, I started to we're now probably like 6 miles from the finish, and we're in 3rd place. And I'm starting to flag. And I said, John, I'm not feeling so good. I go, just run on. I'll catch up with you. He wouldn't leave me. He goes, I'm not leaving you. We've got me this far. And then the guy who was in 3rd went by. I go, John, go now. You can go stay with the guy. And then I started to rally a little bit. And then we just both finished together, and we clasped hands as we came across the finish line in 4th place.
Wow.
That was like 6:22. A race director immediately comes up to us. He goes, hey, guys, I don't have duplicate awards here, so you guys figure it out. And so I just turned to John. I said, John, you're the old guy. I know, it was 33, 34, whatever, and I'm 24, 22, whatever. And I go, it's yours, buddy. It's yours. So he ended up 4th. I ended up 5th. But it was just one of those things you always remember. To think that you're going 50 miles and they don't really have organized aid stations is mind-boggling, too.
What about entry fees back then?
Going back, I'll tell you my first Boston, and that again is some classic stuff. I'm going to say the entry fee was like $15. And you also have to have a doctor's signature to say you were physically able to do it.
Wow.
So you always had to go to a doctor to sign off on that. But one of the great remembers of the first 2 Bostons ran, so 75, 76, were no T-shirts, no aid stations, no mile marks, no clock on the course. And before I tell you the next no, anyone listening to this needs to sit down in a chair because I don't want you to pass out. There were no participation medals.
Wow.
Yeah, so you had, again, no aid stations, no clocks. That year, by the way, 75 was when Roger set the record. It was a premier day. It was 48 degrees with a raging tailwind because Boston is point to point.
Yeah.
Okay, so the very next year, it's the hottest day ever in April in Boston to this day. It's 96 degrees. And you're thinking, like, this is insanity. They took one of those old cars that had bullhorns on it, and they drove the course an hour before, and they pleaded with the people to come out with their lawn hoses.
I remember that.
They called it the run for the hoses instead of the run for the roses. The run for the hoses. Yeah. So you're running in 90 plus degrees and you're thinking, this is crazy. And again, no aid station. So you're dependent on all these people along the way to give you, back then they were big on bringing out orange slices and stuff for whatever reason, but any water you could get was a plus. The other thing you'll love about this is related to IUP is one of the beautiful things about all the great people at IUP, from all the guys in the house and all the things you guys you can think of over the years, Abbott and Danny Friedrich and Jed and Squires and Timmy Lolich and just all the people we ran with through the years, Donnie Friedline, Lamsey, just the whole crew, Todd Eschman, just so much good folks. The neatest thing was Don Slusser, who graduated before most of us got there, would always come back on weekends and run with us. And Don was a premier ultra or marathon runner at that time and road runner in any really distance. He was the sweetest guy as far as mentoring us on how to do the longer distances. And I still remember that January going into the 76 Boston Marathon saying, hey, what are your goals this year, Don? He goes, I'd really like to get in the top 10 at Boston. I'm thinking, God, the top 10 at Boston, good for you. And I noticed it across the finish line, and the worst time I would have in 30 years, it was like, I think the only time I ever ran over 3 hours at Boston in 30 plus years, 40, whatever. And I get on an elevator because back then they would take you up to the Prudential Center cafeteria and feed you beef stew. That was like a tradition.
Right.
And I get in an elevator and the guy had just come up with the results of the top 10. I said, God, look at your sheet there. You chose me the sheet. And who's in the top 10 but Donnie Slusser?
Wow.
And you're going, God, on a 90 plus degree day, Sluss runs at 226. The winner that day was a guy named Jack Foltz, who ran 219, but just a brutal day. And then they still didn't have aid stations by the next year. So the next year, a Canadian named Jerome Drayton won it. And Drayton ran, I think, like a 2:11 and on another hot day, but in the high 70s, low 80s. And he just lambasted them. Said, you call yourself the premier marathon, the most prestigious marathon, get your act together. And by that time, Fred LeBeau, who was running the New York Marathon, he had clocks on the course. He had organized aid stations. So finally in 1978, I remember that was the first year I ever saw organized aid stations. And the people at Boston got together with all the YMCAs and all the little towns along the course. And the YMCAs about every 3 miles would set up aid stations. And there were finally clocks on the course. So it took till 78 for them to actually do those kind of things.
It's mind-boggling. It's really not that long ago, and especially in the history of Boston. Do you know about prize money?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This was a break because it was 1976, give or take a year. But they announced, hey, we're going to finally start handing out prize money. I'm sorry, 1986.
Wow.
We're finally going to hand out prize money. Then Prudential, who was the premier sponsor, said, oh, we're not going to stay with you anymore. They pulled out. And that's when John Hancock jumped in. And John Hancock was the sponsor every year up until this will be their final year. And then next year, I think Bank of America is going to take over.
Wow.
Prize money was the reason why Prudential pulled out, saying, oh, we always supported when it was an amateur event. Now, let's face it, outside the top 20, we're all amateurs.
I want to talk a lot more about your marathoning and your experience of Boston over the years, but let's just finish up with what was the experience with the start of this marathoning at NAIA and university level marathon competition.
Yeah, so the first year I went was 75, and it was neat because if you recall the way the NAIA worked, there were a lot of foreign athletes that came in. So when you lined up in any of the different events, for instance, Mike Boyd, who was a Kenyan who won the bronze medal in the famous 800 meter in 72 when Dave Waddle won.
Yeah.
Boyd won the bronze, but he was NAIA at Eastern New Mexico. So he would be in our competitions. He would be right there at the NAIA around the 800 and 1500. So in the marathon was a guy named Lucian Rosa. And Lucian was there's a little country right off the tip of India called Sri Lanka. He was from Sri Lanka. And so you lined up next to Lucian Rosa in the NAIA. So yeah, and it was just fun times. So you'd go down there with Win Steele. I mean, there were so many neat guys at IUP. And along with, Raymore had a vicious sense of humor. He was just great. And then same with Fry and the whole crew. They're just good folks, man.
And what did the NAIA marathon look like compared to Boston, New York, one of those in terms of organization and course?
It was just tiny. When you talk New York and Boston, you're talking thousands of people, where we line up with, I want to say 40 to 50 runners. So you're just looking around and, okay. I got to tell you one other thing, though, to get away from marathon, but just a sense of humor wise. This is Doc Raymore. The year I'm talking about, 75, it was held in Henderson State in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, was the town. When we could drive in, most of us had seen plenty of groundhogs in Pennsylvania, but we'd never seen armadillos. So we're all out in the courtyard at Henderson State throwing a Frisbee around. And Doc and Sutton, Fry, come back and they go, guys, we got Pepsi over here, Pepsi. And they're holding up this big brown bag. So the sprinter in the group was, and he loved Pepsi, was Ron Steele. And Ron goes tearing over there, rips open the bag, and it's a dead armadillo. And I always joked he has the IUP high jump record, unofficial, because he just leaped to the sky. What the hell is this? Yeah. But good sense of humor there from Doc Raymer for pulling that one off.
What do you remember about, a lot of people listening to this will be from the era, but a lot of people aren't. What was it like to travel then in terms of how you traveled, what the facilities were, and funding and all that?
IUP treated us nicely. We stayed in the dorms at Henderson State. We would drive to Pittsburgh Airport. They'd fly us down. So that was all great. But back to running stuff like Boston, New York, it would just be jamming 5-6 guys in a Toyota in Johnstown and driving up to those places. And then you'd share a hotel room. We'd flip a coin for who was going to sleep on the floor. And then you'd get up and go to the race. So they were loosely organized for sure. But again, good people. And the starting lines weren't real well organized. So you had to fight your way to get to a decent starting spot. And then the first time I saw actually seating at Boston was again in 1978. Because by that time, based on my 227 at New York, I got a top 100 seating. So that was a nice thing that happened there. They were just fun races to be at, but they didn't have 50,000. A big race there would have been 5,000 at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another funny story I got to tell you from the 78 Boston Marathon was my brother Sean, who was the park ranger. He was seasonal the first few years as a park ranger until he got permanent status. And what he would do, he was almost like you. He would just fly off, because seasonal is pretty much May to November. And in between times, he would just fly to like New Zealand and literally get off a plane with a backpack and hitchhike across the country. And then the next year he would go to Ireland. The next year he'd go to somewhere else in Europe or Australia or whatever. So anyway, one year he comes home. It's January now in 78. And he goes, hey, you go to Boston this year? I go, oh, definitely. I said, really hoping to run well there this year. And he goes, well, I'd like to go up and watch. And I said, if you go up and watch, you're going to be standing on the sidewalk saying, God, I wish I was out there. So I said, why don't I just train you for the next couple of months? It's end of January. I can get you fit by mid-April. And just come up and we'll just jump in the back of the pack. I said, you'll be part of the race. So he jumps in as a bandit, runs 3:15, and has the time of his life. I got a photo of him after he finished, and he's just high on life, man. He's just, this is fantastic.
Did he ever run anything else?
Yeah, he would end up running New York. Both my other brother and Sean Clancy is my younger brother. They would both run Marine Corps at some point. And Clance and I still try and do a race. Like I said, I've gotten away from it since the pandemic, but almost every year we would try and at least go out. Like there's a race right now in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh EQT 10 miler. And it's usually the first weekend in November. I think they've run 10 of them. He's run all 10 of those. So he enjoys it, stays fit. And like I said, we try and do at least one together a year. But like I said, from the pandemic, I've gotten away from it. So those guys are always staying active. And Sean was then retired as a park ranger from Shenandoah years ago. He and his wife both had careers at Shenandoah National Park, and they now live just outside of Zion National Park in Utah.
Wow. Nice.
I'm sorry to go off those tangents, by the way.
Oh, that's great stuff. You were a playground sports kid, everything, all the way through all the high school sports. And then you stayed in health and exercise thing. What did you do in university for studies?
Yeah, interesting to say it. I totally hand this off to all the guys at IUP and Ed Fry and all the coaches, because I started out in accounting. And then 2 years in, I thought to myself, I could see all these guys going to have these corporate jobs in Pittsburgh. I thought, that's not for me. And I've learned about physiology of exercise by then. I changed majors. And this is interesting too. A number of people left IUP and went to Ohio University because they had the only sports administration program at that time in all the universities in America. And they'd come back, they'd always talk about this incredible guy who taught exercise physiology named Fritz Hagerman. So I drove out there to meet Fritz Hagerman. I said, hey, I'm really interested in this physiology exercise stuff. He goes, oh, we'd love to have you. I applied to grad school at Ohio University and studied under him for 2 years. Just a wonderful person. And as much as I love IUP and all the people I met there, professors, coaches, friends, same thing happened at Ohio University. Guys like Tom Murray and Bill Havlin. And my thesis advisor was a guy named Kerry Ragg. And Kerry was a sub 220 marathoner, was top 20 at Boston. And he was from New Zealand and had the great Kiwi accent.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you get involved in coaching there?
Yeah, I was the assistant track coach at Ohio University. That was a funny story too. All I want to do is to get some people to run with. So I walk in this town where I know nobody. I'm going to be taking classes in exercise phys. And I knew Bill Haviland was from Athens, Ohio. He worked at the med school, which I didn't know at that time. So I go to the track and cross country coach and I introduced myself. I said, hey, I'm coming here to grad school. I'm really looking for someone to run with. Could I run with the cross country team with you guys? And he looks at me and goes, I really need an assistant coach. Would you be interested in that? And I go, I got to tell you, this is my first year. I'm going to be loaded with studies, and my assistantship had me teaching classes as well as taking classes. So I said, let me think about that. But I do remember I said to the guy, I go, hey, by the way, do you know Bill Haviland? And he looks at me real stern. He goes, only time we see Haviland is when we pass him on the roads. And I'm thinking to myself, that's kind of a curt answer because I thought the guy's a world-class distance runner. Bill would be top 10 at New York, Boston, whatever. He was just a hell of a good runner. He won that Charleston distance race 3 times in a row and they retired the trophy to him. Like 2 weeks later, he's badgering me about, can you be my assistant coach? I thought, okay. So now I'm like stretched like ultra thin because now I'm like coaching him, trying to run, taking my own classes, teaching some classes. And then as I get to meet Hagerman and Ragg and Haviland, I realized they don't like this guy at all.
Wow.
So I'm like in between them and him, trying to make it all work. It was just really bizarre. Just to show you how fast friends I became with Haviland and Hagerman and Kerry Ragg, all those guys. A year later, you barely have 2 nickels to rub together in grad school. I'm running along the bike path and with those guys, and Bill turns to me and goes, Haviland, he goes, hey, Kerry, he goes, where are you staying in New York? I go, I got to tell you, Bill, I'm going to end up hitchhiking home to Johnstown, jumping in a car with 4 other buddies. We're going to drive to some hotel, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, well, he goes, you're welcome to stay with me because Susie, his wife, Susie, wasn't going to go up with him that year. And I go, really? I go, that'd be great. And then literally 2 days later, I'm running along the same guys, and there's a guy named Tim Mickelson. And Tim was a world-class rower. He's got medals from the Olympics and world championships. And Tim goes, hey, Kerry, how are you getting to New York? I go, I'm going to hitchhike home. And it just so happened that the same weekend as the New York Marathon is I guess it's the Boston Marathon version of rowing. It's called the Head of the Charles.
Right. Yeah.
And so because Tim was on the silver medal A team from 1972, his silver medal team would get together and they would literally row that for the next 40 years after they won the silver medal.
Wow.
Tim and Beth were going up there. So he goes, Beth and I are going up. And he goes, we could drop you off in New York and then just pick you up. And I go, I'll tell you what, I'll go with you guys. We'll drive to Johnstown. You stay overnight at my place. Mom and Dad will feed you. And then we'll go on to New York. So they literally dropped me up the George Washington Bridge on a Friday, like at noon. And we both agree, hey, we'll meet here Monday at noon. Then I grab a subway into town where I could check into the Sheraton Hotel because it's Haviland's room. And just have the most wonderful weekend. And then I met at the starting line, Abbott and Slusser, because we were all going to run together starting out in the New York City Marathon. But just the loving people you meet as you go through the world, and that's kind of circle of life, right?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I mean, yeah, it just couldn't have been nicer. And then the race turns into a total abuse because it's hot, it's humid as hell. We go out like maniacs because we were all trying to qualify, and you had to run a 2:22 to qualify for the trials. So we go through the halfway in 1:11, so we're right on pace, right?
Yeah.
But I knew at that point my race was over. I was just sweating like a banshee. I was done. And then right around 18 miles, I could hear this clapping coming. I'm thinking, what's that noise? And guess what it was? Greta Weitz.
Huh.
I never had been beaten by a woman. And back then, we weren't beaten by women.
Wow.
Because they weren't racing that fast. And boy, she went right by me like I was standing still. And then the funniest thing was, So the next day I go to George Washington Bridge. Tim and Beth are there, jump in the car. We're talking about the race, blah, 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 blah. How'd you run, blah, blah, how'd you row, that kind of thing. And then he goes, hey, what was your time again? He goes, you got beat by a woman. So Tim's like kicking my butt, right? You got beat by a woman. I can't believe you got beat by a woman. And then I've got the New York Times there. Okay, and I'm wheeling through it. And it just so happened they had the results because the same day was the Chicago Marathon. Hey, Tim, look at this. Greta would have been second overall in the freaking Chicago.
Wow.
Because back then they weren't passing out money.
Yeah. Wow.
So all the good guys were running in New York, not in Chicago. In New York, everyone knew they had money under the table.
Yeah.
Chicago, there was no money at all. So she literally would have been second overall in the whole Chicago Marathon. So that was my only saving grace.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
That's brilliant. Let me jump to IUP and injury or therapy treatment, because you were well versed in this. And basically we had ice and whirlpool. What else was there?
I don't recall the whirlpool. I remember the ice for sure and stretching. The trainers were nice guys. They were, because they take me up a few times. I think I strained something in my calf and now and again, and nice people. While you mention that, I got some tips for you that I've learned over all the decades of running. But one of them is the whole injury thing. I really wish back then we would have spent time on stretching and strengthening. As a matter of fact, this past September, I went to Colorado, and I got a friend who runs on the University of Colorado Springs track and cross country team. When I got there, took him out to dinner one night. He goes, hey, I was telling my coach about you, and he wants you to come over and meet the team and talk to him. We're having our strength training tomorrow night, and they have strength training twice a week. And it was one of those things that we totally didn't do, right? We did there was no formal stretching, no strengthening. And like you said, then all the sports medicine stuff. I got a tour of it's called the Heupel Center at Colorado Springs University there. And you would not believe the stuff they have for simulate altitude training, humidity training, you name it, they have it. And cool. It was one of the things where you just looked at and you go like, my God, what a world we're in now. Because like you said, we were just grassroots, basic shoes. Like I said, I even started running in basketball shoes. And even remember the asphalt track we ran on?
Yeah. But yeah, I remember you just pretty much went into the ice every day after running, it seemed.
Yeah, back then you just put an ice pack on your calf or quad or whatever was bothering you if it was. So
yeah. On the strength, I also remember talking to Jim Wooding after he left IUP, and he said, yeah, now I lift weights. I barely run anymore. And my times in the hundreds going down. All my sprint times, I've discovered weight training. So even there in the early 80s, it was an eye-opener, effective training across the sport.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
No doubt about it. Kerry Green is a great interview. We haven't even gotten to his 5 decades of running Boston and many more stories about running in the 70s. We'll get to those in episode 2. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.